shows, first of all, that the road to recovery is still paved with uncertainty. We have a few main messages from the forecast that I will give you at the beginning. First, the pandemic has hit the European economy harder than previously expected, even if a cautious rebound is now beginning. In the euro area, GDP is forecast to shrink by 8.7 this year and to increase by 6.1 in 2021. For the EU as a whole, the economy is forecast to contract by 8.3 in 2020 and grow by 5.8 in 2021. The contraction in 2020 is thus set to be around 1 percentage point worse than projected in the spring forecast, and growth in 2021 will also be slightly less robust than projected in the spring. Second, quick and decisive policy measures have so far prevented a larger slump in European labour markets. Jobs have been preserved by various measures, in particular short-time work schemes that have helped keep employees attached to their jobs. But going forward, the success of these measures will depend on the pace of the recovery. Third, we see widening divergences across countries. Although we are all hit by a common shock, it has impacted member states differently. The risk of an increasing divergence was the rationale for proposing our common recovery plan, and this risk appears to be materializing. And this is the argument for Next Generation EU, and this argument is now stronger than ever. Fourth, inflation is expected to remain relatively low this year and to move slightly higher towards the end of the forecast horizon. And fifth, uncertainty remains high, and risks to the forecast continue to be mainly tilted to the downside. So now let us enter in more details. In the first quarter, the first of 2020, the European economy was hit by the pandemic. And although in most countries confinement measures were only implemented in the second half of March, the decline from the preceding quarter was already the largest ever seen in the euro area. The pandemic and measures taken to contain the spread mainly impacted economic activity in the second quarter, which is expected to have been the worst drop in GDP since the Second World War. The hit to economic activity was so strong that a partial rebound in the second half of the year will not be able to lift the annual growth rate in a significant way. The chart shows how far we will have moved away from the growth path that we had expected before the pandemic occurred. In terms of annual output, real GDP in 2021 will remain below the level that had been recorded in 2019 and further below, obviously, the level we had expected before the pandemic. Real global output outside the EU is estimated to have contracted by more than 3% in the first quarter, quarter on quarter. The decline in the first quarter mostly reflects measures to contain the virus taken by China. Most other countries implemented containment measures only late in the first quarter and in the second quarter, as the epidemic became global. Therefore, the output collapse in the second quarter of 2020 is likely to be much deeper at a global level. Business activity is likely to have reached a trough in April, reflected by the Global Composite Purchasing Manager Index, reaching an all-time low of 26.2, far below the threshold of 50, which separates expansion from contraction. The downturn in the services sector was particularly strong, especially in tourism, transport, and recreation. However, data released in late June and early July already point to a moderate improvement. The still rising daily infections at the global level do not bode well for the world economy. We consider that the outlook for global growth outside the EU has weakened further since the spring. Prospects have sharply deteriorated in a number of emerging markets, where rising infections are leading to stricter and longer lockdowns. Overall, real global GDP, excluding the EU, is forecast to contract by around 4% in 2020 before a recovery of 5% in 2021. The European economy is slowly moving from a state of hibernation to a new normal. And as easing progresses, mobility has bounced back. On average, euro area mobility in the second quarter is estimated to have been about 30% below normal. Yet, by the end of June, mobility has already recovered to about minus 10%. However, compulsory or voluntary social distancing will continue for some time and is necessary, and some habits may have changed for good. In other words, the European economy is approaching a new normality, which is reflected in the assumption underpinning this forecast. The euro area is thought to have experienced a cumulative hit to GDP of around 17% in the first half of the year. So 17% in the first half of 2020. The GDP decline is expected to have been particularly pronounced in the second quarter, around 13.5% quarter on quarter. In the first half of 2020, the euro area labour market underwent a massive deterioration, which translated essentially into a sharp decline in the number of hours worked. However, this has not fully fed to unemployment figures. So, very clearly in number of hours worked, but not in unemployment figures at the moment. What is clear is that the recent increases in unemployment have been small compared to the decline in economic activity. This marks a substantial difference from developments outside Europe, such as in the US, where layoffs have occurred immediately and in large numbers. The extended short-time work schemes have played an important role in keeping employees attached to their jobs. However, these schemes are not identical in all member states, which contributes to market differences. And in the future, the EU's new instrument for temporary support to mitigate unemployment risk in an emergency, this is the famous acronym SURE, should limit such differences by helping countries to cover the cost of national short-time work schemes. Forward-looking indicators of the labour market send positive signals, but caution is needed. A number of factors are expected to slow the labour market's return to its pre-pandemic situation. Many short-time work subsidy schemes are limited in time, and despite recent extensions, the schemes will not indefinitely preserve the employment relationship and support incomes. Inflation. Inflation in the euro area has fallen to an annual rate of below 0.5%, driven by the fall in energy prices. The inflation outlook has not changed substantially since spring, but there are 4 new factors overall balancing one another. First, the higher oil price assumptions limit the dampening impact of the energy component of inflation. Second, food prices increased more than expected in the second quarter. Third, temporary VAT cuts and other fiscal measures will lower inflation in 2020, with reversed and positive base effects in the second half of 2021. Fourth, the weaker economic outlook will continue to exert a downward drag on price pressures. Overall, euro area headline inflation is forecast to average 0.3% in 2020 and to increase to 1.1% in 2021. Now let's give a more narrow look to the GDP for this year and next. The economy of each EU member state is expected to contract in 2020 and to bounce back in 2021. So contraction and bouncing back are in all member states. The divergences across countries in terms of both the recession and the rebound are there, and they are related to different timing and stringency of lockdowns and containment, as well as different economic structures, namely exposure to tourism and services reliant on person-to-person contact. As we have revised our assumptions about containment measures, the expected differences across member states have also become larger. In 2020, relatively strong GDP contractions are projected for France, Italy, and Spain, whereas milder contractions are expected for Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland. Growth, I repeat, is expected for all economies, but without substantially narrowing differences. So 2021, the rebound, but not narrowing the differences. I would say without a strong policy intervention. In Germany, annual GDP in 2020 is now projected to fall by 6.3%. The large fiscal stimulus is expected to avert severe income and job losses, limit insolvencies, and boost consumptions and investment. This should help sustain the recovery in the second half of 2020, so we project growth of around 5.3% in 2021. In France, GDP is expected to fall by 10.6% in 2020, which mainly reflects the fall of GDP by almost 17% quarter-on-quarter in the second quarter. A rebound in activity has already been observed over the second half of May and June as a result of lifting of lockdown measures. Following the gradual recovery starting in mid-2020, GDP is set to expand by 7.6% in 2021. In Italy, the pandemic pushed the economy into a deep contraction in the first 2 quarters of 2020. Meanwhile, high-frequency indicators suggest that economic activity began to recover in May and is recovering in June. The Italian economy is set to start bouncing back in the third quarter of this year, helped by substantial policy support. Annual GDP is set to fall by 11.2% in 2020, before picking up to 6.1% in 2021. In Spain, the impact of the confinement in the first half of 2020 looks likely to turn out worse than expected in the spring forecast. Although all indicators show that activity is recovering fast, as restrictions are being lifted, the rebound will only partially offset the larger contraction in the first half of this year. Annual GDP in 2020 is now forecast to contract by 10.9%, and the outlook for 2021 remains broadly unchanged compared to spring at about 7.1%. In the Netherlands, real GDP is forecast to decline by about 6.8% this year, with all demand components except public consumption contracting sharply, before seeing a partial recovery of 4.6% in 2021. In Poland, the economy proved resilient in the first quarter of 2020, but in the second, real GDP is expected to plunge before gradually recovering. Overall, this is projected to result in a contraction of 4.6% in 2020 and a rebound of about 4.3% in 2021. In conclusion, I want to repeat that uncertainty is surrounding this summer interim forecast. Despite the very solid work done by DG ECFIN, I think that the scale and duration of the pandemic being essentially unknown keep this uncertainty very strong also to this forecast. And risks are not all, but mostly on the downside, as already was the case in our spring forecast. First, assumptions about the pandemic could be optimistic. In the absence of a vaccine and treatment option for COVID-19, any sustained increase in the number of infections or further major outbreaks would worsen the economic outlook. Second, the labour market could be affected worse than expected. In the absence of a rapid recovery in demand, firms may proceed with more widespread layoffs when the temporary short-time work schemes come to an end. Third, solvency problems could affect more companies than currently expected. A rise in corporate defaults could prevent companies from restructurings and end up in liquidations with further knock-on effects on employment and on the financial sectors. Fourth, despite the stability attained through central bank initiatives, episodes of turbulences in financial markets cannot be completely excluded, particularly given the recent decoupling of developments in financial markets and in the real economy. Finally, if the transition period with the UK ends with no agreement, that would falsify the purely technical assumption of an unchanged trading relationship, and this would be a negative outcome for both sides, though particularly negative for the UK. We have also risks, so to say, on the upside. And first of all, a swifter than expected rebound cannot be excluded, particularly if the epidemiological situation allows faster lifting of remaining restriction than assumed. And this will also bring to a reduction of the level of uncertainty that is still surrounding our economies. Second, so to say, upside risk, the rapid implementation of the Commission's proposed recovery plan built around Next Generation EU, which is not calculated in its effect in our forecast, would help to brighten the economic outlook, including by quickly delivering a boost to confidence. Let me conclude by recalling that there is a human story behind these numbers, and sorry to have mentioned many of them, which would have been unthinkable at the start of this year. The economic upheaval is the result of a pandemic that has claimed the lives of 530 million people worldwide until now, a number still rising by the day, in some parts of the world at an alarming rate. And of course, while the policy response across Europe has helped to cushion the blow for our citizens, this remains a story of increasing inequality, poverty, and insecurity. And we should never forget this dimension of this crisis. This is why it is so important that an agreement is reached swiftly on the recovery plan and the new multi-annual financial framework to inject both new confidence and new financing into our economy at this so critical time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We are now ready to take your questions, and I already see a first question from Athanasios, Cyprus News Agency. Athanasios, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Athanasios, Cyprus News Agency, and Star TV Greece as well. Commissioner, I see the numbers, the figures for Greece. I see that you're now projecting growth of 6% for 2021 and a recession of 9% for 2020. That's, in broad terms, quite the same as your spring forecast, but still, and given the comments you have already made for the depth and the risks of these recessions, countries like Greece are still reluctant to go to the ESM and tap the full potential of the instruments that are already agreed at the European level. What could you say to those countries? Should they be more vigilant and try to explore more the possibilities that are already in place for the containment of this recession? And secondly, should they already take, let's say, reform measures to be able to exploit more the upcoming Next Generation EU and the tools that will be available when agreed? Because we now see that even this already agreed policy transmission from the EIB, from all the other funds to the real economy in Greece is not really taking place. There are restraints, but banks are still refusing to lend money to the real economy, to businesses, unless they have substantial guarantees and so on. So how are you going to answer to that practically, I mean? Thanks.
Well, thank you for your question. I think that the Greek authorities reacted quickly and quite well to this crisis, to the pandemic. Despite these facts, the risk for the economy are there, also because of the structure of the economy, of the importance of some sectors, especially tourism and transport and shipment for the Greek economy. So good reaction, but situation difficult as in other member states. As a Commission, in relation to the ESM and other instruments, we worked to make them available and to make them available without the macroeconomic conditionalities that were there when these instruments were used in previous occasions. I think we were successful in this effort, and we have these tools there, but of course it's for member states to decide if and when to use them. Finally, on our national recovery and resilience plans, I strongly support the idea that after the approval from the European Council, we have to receive these proposals from member states already this autumn, because a dialogue is very important, and you know the priorities are connected to our strategic priority in the Commission and to our country-specific recommendation, but you also know that the ownership of these proposals is to national governments.
Thank you very much. We will now move to Jorge Valero from Euractiv.
Good morning, Commissioner. I have two questions as well. The first one is, in light of today's forecast and the deficit and debt figures from May, when do you think that Spain should start implementing fiscal adjustments, and whether do you think they should be part of the resilient plans in autumn or next spring in order to access the funds? And secondly, the European Fiscal Board and also Mr. Centeno in an interview with the FT today talk about the debt threshold, and they said that, they agree that this is an unrealistic goal, the 60% threshold. So they call for a review of the Stability and Growth Pact. Do you consider that the 60% threshold is also an unrealistic goal, and would you agree that it needs to be reviewed as part of the Commission's review plan of the Stability and Growth Pact?
I think that for sure Spain was one of the countries with stronger impact of this pandemic and also with strong impact from the human point of view. And first of all, from our side, there is solidarity towards countries more impacted by this pandemic. The economic consequences are there in our forecast, but we were very clear on the fact that this is the time of reaction to this crisis to prevent further and more serious, even more serious than those that we already have, consequences in economy. This means that the discussion on the level of debt should not disappear, because this, in the medium-long term, remains an issue for all member states and governments, but is not the number one priority in these weeks and months. As far as the review of our fiscal rules is concerned, in fact, we launched it exactly 2 or 3 weeks before the outbreak, beginning of February, and in a certain sense, events made until now the review more than ourselves. So events are showing the importance and the necessity of having rules helping what is strongly needed after this crisis. And first of all, I would mention, as the European Fiscal Board mentioned, the effort for facilitate public investment. This discussion will be a little bit postponed. It was supposed to finish at the end of this year. We will finish it next year. I think that after the summer, it's a perfect timing because the economy are gradually recovering to reopen this discussion, and we have to do it with a strategic mindset, because the decision that we will take on the conclusion of the general escape clause, on the review of these rules next spring, will probably shape our economic policy for the years to come. So this is a very important discussion, and it is not a discussion about thresholds. It is a discussion about substance of our fiscal stance.
Thank you very much. We will now move to Marine Khan from the FT. Marine, press the speak button.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. I want to follow up on that question also. The European Fiscal Board also raised the point about what is the criteria the Commission will look at when it thinks about when to, reverse the general escape clause. Can you give us any sense of that? I mean, are we talking about when a member state reaches its pre-crisis GDP, when they don't have to do a fiscal contraction once the rules are back? Can you give us some sense of what was going to be foremost in your mind? Because a lot of member states in the Northern Eurozone would like normality to return pretty fast. And I also want to ask a question about the allocation criteria. The forecast shows that Poland clearly will suffer the shallowest recession of any member state by some distance. However, Poland is probably in line to be among the top 3 or top 5 beneficiaries of the recovery fund. How do you justify that? And surely does this not just embolden the claims that the allocation criteria is not a real reflection of the COVID-19 impact? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, I would say what I have in mind, but the discussion will be a long one and not an easy one, because the decisions that have to be taken next year are very important. From the legal point of view, what is written is that we trigger the general escape clause in case of severe downturn, economic downturn affecting the EU as a whole. We don't have precedents. This means that you untrigger the clause when this situation of severe economic downturn affecting the Europe as a whole is no more there. What does this mean? I think a good point to begin this discussion was made exactly from Niels Tiggesen and the European Fiscal Board in his paper, when he referred to the fact that we are not only referring to the fact that member states will, in 2021, be in a growth path, because this is for sure, and it is obvious. But he was referring to, he was taking as a reference the situation of GDP growth of 2019. So not so much only going back to growth, but going to at least to the situation we were before pandemic. But, you know, there are several other aspects to consider, and we have to honestly say that we don't have previous experience to refer to. We only know, and this was a very clear point in the European Fiscal Board report, that we have to avoid a double-dip recession, because this risk is something that we have avoided. At the same time, you have to bring again our economies in a path of common rules and common coordination. On allocation keys, well, I don't think that in nature a perfect system of allocation keys exists. What you said about Poland is a point, but I think that the Commission's proposal was made considering the necessity to refer to solid data and not to forecast changing by the day, and to refer to structural also economic data, because we have countries not so much affected by the pandemic in terms of number of infections or casualties, but very strongly affected by the lockdowns from the economic point of view. And so this is the rationale of this allocation key. I understand that this will be one of the discussion issue for the Council, but I think that the rationale of the Commission's proposal is a good one. The perfection doesn't exist in this kind of things, I think.
Thank you. We will now move to David Carretta from Radio Radicale.
Radio Radicale, if you don't mind, I will ask my question in Italian for broadcasting reasons. Commissario, una domanda sull'Italia e soprattutto le previsioni per il 2021, se guardiamo 2020-2021, l'Italia è il paese che si troverà più indietro rispetto ai livelli del 2019 e con una differenza molto significativa, almeno un punto di PIL rispetto ai paesi successivi e molto di più rispetto per esempio alla Germania. Quali sono le ragioni? Sono ragioni strutturali che hanno a che fare con la situazione contingente, perché non sono state fatte riforme strutturali e cosa bisogna fare per recuperare tutto questo? Grazie.
Ma direi che la ragione di fondo dal punto di vista di questo momento, perché poi i nostri forecast sono sempre delle fotografie che tengono conto dell'evoluzione della situazione, ma sono anche influenzati dalla situazione del momento. La ragione fondamentale è che l'Italia è stata relativamente in Europa il paese con forse il periodo di chiusura più prolungato, nel senso che è stato il paese che ha introdotto per primo le misure di lockdown e poi le ha rilasciate più o meno in contemporanea con gli altri paesi. E siccome abbiamo visto l'impatto devastante che i lockdown hanno sulle economie, questo viene considerato quando si prevede che l'Italia, come la Francia, come la Spagna, ma anche leggermente di più della Francia e della Spagna, abbia un impatto così serio. Le previsioni sulla ripresa dell'anno prossimo sono basate su diversi fattori, non ultimo la preoccupazione perché la zona più colpita è stata una zona diciamo spesso trainante, motore dell'economia italiana, le preoccupazioni che ci sono sul commercio internazionale, qui essendo l'Italia un paese molto orientato alle esportazioni, ma comunque si prevede un rimbalzo di crescita oltre il 6%. E penso che non bisogna concentrarsi tanto sulle differenze tra paese e paese, ma sulla sfida che questa ripresa propone per il governo e per tutti gli italiani.
Thank you. We will now move to Susana Freshes.
Thank you, Susana Freixas, SIC Portugal. On Portugal, we see that the figures are quite different and worse compared to only 2 months ago. We were now talking about a recession of 9.8, which is much bigger than 2 months ago. And we also see that this is quite related to the tourism sector. What do you expect it will happen during these months? Because these are the most important months for Portugal in terms of tourism. Do you expect that in October maybe the next forecast will be talking an even deeper recession? Do you fear this? And still on the allocation key, even if there's no such thing like a perfect allocation key, shouldn't the leaders be talking about a different distribution key now to take into account also these figures, at least for a specific amount of money, also to take more into account the tourism? Don't we risk be distributing money in an unfair way? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, there is a difference in our summer forecast in relation to the spring forecast, and the difference is based on a worse than projected outcome in the first quarter and a slower than expected recovery in foreign tourism, particularly in the number of flights, and also on the delayed until a few days ago reopening of the border with Spain, several aspects brought our forecast to be more pessimistic than the spring forecast. We are not more pessimistic, also slightly a little bit more optimistic on the rebound in 2021 for Portugal. But I think that this is confirming how the uncertainty on flights, global tourism can affect, in particular, economies that are strongly connected to this. How to tackle this, I think, is one of the mission of our recovery strategy and of our recovery packages. I imagine that the allocation keys will be discussed by the leaders from all points of view, including this one, but I don't want to repeat what I already said on allocation keys.
Thank you. We will now take the last two questions, and the first is from Philip Blenkinsop.
Yeah, Philip Blenkinsop of Reuters. Thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask. You referred, I think, in your statement, and also in the statement that was issued, to the rising rate of infections, particularly, I think it says, in the United States and emerging markets. That is a section which isn't included as a risk. It almost implies that it's something that you're already taking into account, or you have taken into account in your current forecasts. Now, as you've well seen, the rate of infections in the United States in particular has been hitting record levels. I wondered if you could kind of talk about what that implies for the global economy and for the European economy specifically, in terms of the clearly the kind of potential for more lockdowns or tighter lockdowns there.
Yes, indeed. When I said at the beginning of my presentation that the road to recovery is paved with uncertainty, this is mostly linked to uncertainty, to epidemiological uncertainty, for sure. I think we heard this morning news about one of the biggest Australian cities deciding a lockdown, and these kind of local outbreaks, I don't think we have to have in mind. Well, I'm not an expert. I'm speaking for the economic attitude of consumers and investors. We don't have to think to the risk of the Spanish flu repeating, the Spanish flu experience repeating. But we have to think of the possibility that for a certain amount of time we have to live with the danger of local outbreaks. And this should bring us from one side to keep our safety measures, and from the other side to keep in mind that economic activity should regain momentum even if this kind of risks are still there. Without this basis, we wouldn't have reopened our economies. So we decided in Europe, I think very wisely, to wait, but at a certain time to reopen our economy, not at full speed, keeping measures, but knowing that we can live, we can be obliged to live with local outbreaks for the future. So for sure this is affecting the path of recovery. Uncertainty is the real problem of our economy now.
The next question will go to Tommaso Galavotti, please.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me? I guess so.
Yes, yeah? We can hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for taking my question. I will ask them in Italian, if I may, as for broadcasting reasons. Sono due domande. La prima, mi perdoni se insisto sul MES, so che lei ha spiegato in tutti i modi possibili e immaginabili che non ci sono condizionalità connesse, però in Italia si continuano a leggere cose. Un economista come Gustavo Piga, che non è un sovranista, ma un economista molto rispettato, dice sostanzialmente che accettare il MES non conviene perché equivarrebbe a riconoscere la necessità del fiscal compact. Volevo capire se questo ragionamento la convince oppure se secondo lei è privo di fondamento. La seconda è semplicemente le vorrei chiedere se tutti nella Commissione concordano sul fatto che la clausola generale di salvaguardia debba essere rimossa quando verranno recuperati i livelli pre-crisi, se tutti sono d'accordo su questo. Grazie mille.
Ma il meccanismo europeo di stabilità non ha nulla a che fare con l'accettazione o non accettazione del patto di stabilità. Peraltro i Paesi membri condividono il patto di stabilità e crescita, che è una regola comune europea. Stiamo discutendo delle sue norme attuative, della possibilità di rivedere queste norme, ma diciamo, il patto in sé diciamo, non è collegato in nessun modo alle risorse del MES. La cosa importante per le risorse del MES è che si è lavorato, perché sappiamo benissimo che all'origine il MES era nato con una finalità completamente diversa e quindi aveva delle condizionalità macroeconomiche, diciamo, per definizione insite nel suo meccanismo. Abbiamo lavorato perché queste condizionalità macroeconomiche fossero eliminate, perché la valutazione sulla sostenibilità del debito fosse fatta in contemporanea per tutti i Paesi e prima dell'avvio della richiesta delle linee di credito, perché i report sull'utilizzo delle linee di credito si riferissero solo alle spese sanitarie e fossero inseriti nell'andamento del semestre. Penso che abbiamo fatto un buon lavoro. Rimane il fatto che spetta ai singoli governi decidere se e quando utilizzare. Per quanto riguarda invece la discussione futura sulle regole del patto di stabilità, io riferivo quella osservazione al report dell'European Fiscal Board che il professor Tigersen ha illustrato nell'ultima riunione del collegio della Commissione, proponendo come punto di riferimento, visto che non abbiamo precedenti e non abbiamo regole scritte, come punto di riferimento per concludere la fase della General Escape Clause non un semplice ritorno alla crescita, ma un ritorno alla situazione precedente. Naturalmente per l'insieme dei Paesi, perché la valutazione dovrà essere una valutazione complessiva. Non basta che uno o due Paesi vadano alla grande, non basta che due o tre Paesi siano ancora in gravissime difficoltà. Il sistema, la valutazione sarà e dovrà essere una valutazione complessiva. Il criterio suggerito dallo European Fiscal Board mi sembra interessante.
Thank you, and we will take a very last question from Catherine Fior.
Hi, Catherine Fior, EU reporter. I'm just a bit curious about one aspect of the report. You say that the technical assumption is that you maintain the status quo with the UK in terms of their trading relations, but we now know that there is no intention that there will be no extension of the current transitional arrangements. And while you may be ambivalent about the impact on the UK's economy, what about, why isn't that factored into your assessments of other economies? Ireland in particular would be deeply affected by a change in the trading relationship. So I'm just a bit curious that you've stuck to the status quo, even though we are now absolutely sure and certain as of the end of June that will no longer exist.
Yes, you are right. This is a technically difficult point, but the fact is that the assumption is not referring to particular schemes of a trade agreement with the UK, because we can't do that until we don't have an agreement. So we mention the relation with the UK in the so-called downside risks, referring to a scenario with the transition ending with no agreement. No agreement is mentioned on the downside. One of the possible downside risks is a no agreement scenario. An agreement scenario will be evaluated and can be evaluated only when we will know what kind of agreement scenario we will have. So this is why technically we are assuming the situation as it is, but we are saying if there is a no agreement, we will have for sure a downside risk.
Thank you, Commissioner, for this press conference, and thank you very much for following us on EBS. And you have now another press conference at 11 on the Rapid Alert System report from Commissioner Reinders, so please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is thus set to be around 1% growth in 2021 will also be slightly less robust than projected in the spring.